first thing the desert keeps is silence, not the empty kind, but the heavy, watchful silence of a place that has already seen kings rise, gods change their names, priests whisper in the dark, and workmen seal doorways they hope no one will ever open again. In the Valley of the Kings, the limestone cliffs fold around the land like the walls of an enormous natural tomb. By day, the sun turns them pale gold and white, almost too bright to look at. By evening, the shadows stretch across the broken ground, filling every crack, every abandoned cutting, every hidden stair with the feeling that something is still waiting underneath. Here, on the west bank of the Nile, where Egyptians once placed their dead in the direction of the setting sun, one of the most famous rulers in history lies not because he was powerful in life, but because the world forgot him just enough for the earth to protect him. Tutankhamun is not the greatest pharaoh Egypt ever produces. He does not build the largest monuments. He does not conquer vast territories. He does not reign for decades, like the kings whose names thunder through temple walls. He comes to the throne young, rules briefly, and vanishes into a troubled age that later Egyptians are not eager to remember. Yet more than 3,000 years after his burial, his name becomes almost a spell. King Tut, the golden mask, the sealed tomb, the boy pharaoh. The curse whispered through newspapers, the glittering rooms crowded with beds, chariots, shrines, statues, jewels, sandals, food, weapons, walking sticks, and strange intimate objects placed there so that a dead king might continue living beyond the horizon. His fame begins not with an empire, but with a doorway, a blocked entrance cut into the valley floor, hidden beneath rubble, huts, and time. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of Tutankhamun is not only the story of treasure, it is the story of how survival can distort memory. It is the story of a king who nearly disappeared, and then became the face of ancient Egypt to millions of people who would never stand beneath the desert cliffs where he was buried. The Valley of the Kings is already ancient with loss by the time modern archaeology arrives. For centuries, tomb robbers, travellers, officials, scholars, and collectors have crossed its dust. Many royal tombs have been opened, damaged, emptied, or reused. The great kings of the New Kingdom sleep uneasily here, surrounded by corridors painted with cosmic journeys, gods with animal heads, solar boats, serpents, gates, stars, and spells meant to carry the royal soul through the dangers of the night. Their tombs are grander than Tutankhamun's, their reigns are better recorded, their political weight is heavier, and yet, for the modern imagination, many of them remain strangely less vivid than the young king whose burial chamber is small, cramped, and almost hidden in plain sight. That is one of the first secrets of Tutankhamun. The tomb does not overwhelm because it is vast. It overwhelms because it survives. The treasures are not arranged like museum pieces in clean empty space. They are packed into rooms with the density of a life abruptly folded shut. There are objects of sacred power beside objects of daily use. A throne gleams with images of royal intimacy and restored divinity. Chariots lie disassembled, their wheels and bodies fitted into the crowded rooms. Boxes contain linen garments, jewellery, tools, and containers that still carry the practical logic of a court that expected the afterlife to require preparation. There are couches shaped like divine animals, guardian figures standing like silent sentinels, and nested shrines enclosing the coffin of a king whose body becomes in death the centre of a golden universe. But the gold can mislead. It is easy to see the mask and imagine certainty. Gold feels final. It seems to say that everything important has been preserved, yet the opposite is closer to the truth. The glittering survival of Tutankhamun's tomb exposes how much remains missing. His reign is a puzzle built from fragments. His family belongs to one of the most controversial periods in Egyptian history, the age of Akhenaten, when the traditional religious order is shaken by the rise of the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, and the court moves to a new royal city at Amarna. After that experiment falters, Egypt turns back toward its older gods, especially Amun, and the name Tutankhamun itself seems to carry the mark of restoration. What survives in the record suggests a young king placed at the center of a political and religious repair effort much larger than himself. But how much he chooses, how much he understands, and how much is decided by powerful adults around the throne remains uncertain. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness gives the story its strange power. Archaeology often begins with what is absent: missing names, damaged inscriptions, reused objects, broken seals, tomb walls painted in haste or with unusual choices. A royal body examined again and again by different generations, each with better tools, each asking slightly different questions. Was Tutankhamun frail? Was he injured? Did infection play a role in his death? Did inherited conditions weaken him? Was his burial rushed because his death came unexpectedly? Scholars still debate the details, not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence does not speak in a single, simple voice. Ancient bodies do not explain themselves neatly. Tombs are not diaries. Gold does not tell the whole truth. Even the landscape seems designed to keep that truth half covered. The Valley of the Kings is not lush, not soft, not forgiving. It is a dry maze of stone, glare, and shadow, cut off from the green ribbon of the Nile by cliffs and desert ridges. The Egyptians chose such western places partly because the west is where the sun dies each evening and is reborn each morning. Death, in this world, is not an ending without shape. It is a passage, a dangerous transformation, a movement from the visible world into a hidden one where the dead king must be protected, named, fed, dressed, guided, and magically defended. To bury a pharaoh is to build a machine for eternity. Every amulet, coffin, shrine, and painted figure has a task. Every sealed doorway is part of a plan. Even the smallest object might carry meaning beyond its material value. Tutankhamun's tomb draws modern eyes because it feels almost impossibly close. Unlike ruins stripped bare by centuries, it still contains traces of handling, decision, pressure, and care. The contents are magnificent, but also human. There are sandals for royal feet, garments folded away, sticks that may have been ceremonial, practical, or both, games for leisure, food and wine for the afterlife, cosmetic containers, model boats, weapons that speak of kingship, not always battlefield use. A child king becomes an adult symbol in death, surrounded by the equipment of eternity and the remains of a court determined to present him as a proper pharaoh, however short his reign had been. The result is both majestic and oddly intimate, as if someone closed the door on a palace room and never returned. Yet the tomb is not untouched in a perfect sense. Ancient robbers appear to have entered parts of it not long after the burial, taking certain portable valuables before the tomb was resealed. That small disturbance matters. It means Tutankhamun was not protected by complete invisibility from the beginning. Rather, he survived through a chain of accidents: partial robbery, official resealing, later construction or debris hiding the entrance, the fading of his historical importance, and then the long patience of the valley itself. No single explanation fully accounts for why this tomb endured when so many others did not. Chance plays a role, politics plays a role, geography plays a role, forgetting plays a role. It is a strange comfort to think that history sometimes preserves not what it values most, but what it happens to overlook. By the early 20th century, many believe the Valley of the Kings has little left to give. Its famous tombs have been mapped, entered, catalogued, and argued over. The age of spectacular discovery seems to be ending. But beneath layers of rubble and workmen's huts, under a patch of ground that has been crossed many times, the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb remains sealed away. The young king waits under stone, under silence, under the weight of a civilization that has itself become a mystery to the modern world. Above him, empires change, languages rise and vanish, religions transform. The Nile continues its long movement through Egypt. The cliffs keep their shape. Sand drifts, settles, and shifts again. And in that hidden space, the rooms remain crowded with the dead king's second life. The guardians stand in darkness. The shrines enclose their secret. The mask waits over the face of a ruler who once stood at the fragile centre of Egypt's return to older gods. The objects do not know they are treasure yet. They are still doing what they were placed there to do, protecting, supplying, surrounding, and transforming Tutankhamun for eternity. The modern world has not yet leaned toward a small opening in the stone and glimpsed the glow inside. The newspapers have not yet invented their fever of curses and wonders. The photographs have not yet carried his golden face across the planet. For now, there is only the valley, the sealed door, and the silence of a king almost erased. By the autumn of 1922, the Valley of the Kings has already trained many people to expect disappointment. The old dream of finding a royal tomb still sealed, still rich, still holding the atmosphere of ancient burial, has begun to feel almost unreasonable. Too many tombs have been opened. Too many corridors have been emptied by ancient thieves or damaged by time. Too many promising patches of earth have yielded only fragments, workmen's debris, broken pottery, or the exhausted remains of someone else's earlier search. Howard Carter knows this better than anyone. He has spent years in Egypt, not as a romantic outsider casually chasing gold, but as a patient excavator, artist, and inspector who understands that the desert usually gives its secrets in crumbs. A painted chip can matter, a seal impression can matter, a scrap of linen, a jar label, a broken stair under rubble can open a passage into history. Still, even patience has a cost. And by 1922, the search for Tutankhamun is close to ending. Carter's patron, Lord Carnarvon, has funded the work for years, and the results have not matched the expense. Their concession in the Valley of the Kings has produced interesting material, but not the great discovery both men hope for. Carter remains convinced that something has been missed. The name of Tutankhamun has appeared in scattered traces from the valley, small objects and hints that suggest the young king may still be nearby. It is not proof in the dramatic sense. It is the kind of evidence archaeology often depends on, indirect, stubborn, and easy to dismiss. The evidence remains incomplete, but Carter reads the valley as a landscape of absences. A royal king of the 18th dynasty should have had a burial. If that burial has not been clearly accounted for, then either it has been destroyed, robbed beyond recognition, or hidden in a place no one has properly cleared. The search narrows toward a patch of ground near the tomb of Rameses VI, where ancient workmen's huts once stood. This is not glamorous terrain. It is hard, cluttered, already crossed by earlier activity, and overshadowed by a more visible royal tomb. Yet such places can be protective precisely because they seem unpromising. Later construction, rubble, and the habits of daily labour can conceal what formal searching misses. Carter's team begins clearing the area carefully, and on the morning of November 4th, 1922, the valley changes. Beneath the debris appears the top of a cut step. It is not much to look at first. Stone emerging from dust, a line where the human hand has shaped the earth. But to an excavator trained by years of failure, a step is not merely a step, it is direction. It means a descent, an entrance, an intention hidden below the surface. More steps appear as the clearing continues. The staircase leads downward toward a blocked doorway, sealed with plaster. On that sealed entrance are impressions left by ancient officials, including the mark of the royal necropolis. At first, the name is not immediately the simple answer everyone wants. The doorway has suffered disturbance and resealing, and the marks include signs that suggest official action after an intrusion. But the possibility becomes electric. A sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings is already rare enough. A sealed doorway in the right area, linked by surrounding clues to the nearly forgotten Tutankhamun, is something else entirely. Carter has to resist the urge to rush. Archaeology at this moment becomes a discipline of restraint. Every stone moved too quickly could destroy information. Every seal, every fill layer, every sign of ancient disturbance needs attention. He sends word to Akhenaten, who is in England. The message must carry hope without guaranteeing too much. That is the strange etiquette of great discoveries before they fully reveal themselves. Carter cannot yet say he has found a royal tomb untouched by history. He can say he has found a sealed entrance that may be important. Akhenaten comes to Egypt with his daughter, and the waiting begins under a pressure that must have felt almost physical. The desert has offered a door, but not yet its answer. In the days before the formal opening, the excavators protect the site and cover the entrance again. The valley, which has waited over 3,000 years, now forces modern people to wait a little longer. When work resumes, the sealed doorway is removed carefully enough to reveal a descending passage packed with rubble. This corridor, filled deliberately in antiquity, is more than a simple obstruction. It is part of the tomb's defense, a plug against entry, a statement that beyond this point lies a protected royal space. The fill itself contains clues. It has been disturbed and restored. Ancient robbers appear to have entered at least part of the tomb, then officials resealed the passage. This is one of the quiet complications that will follow Tutankhamun's story from the beginning. The tomb is not a perfect time capsule in the purest sense. It is something more interesting, a damaged, repaired, protected survival. What survives in the record suggests both violation and rescue, both human greed and human duty. At the end of the passage lies another sealed doorway. This second barrier is the true threshold of wonder. Behind it, Carter cannot yet know what waits. It might be a cache, it might be a robbed tomb, it might be a half-empty chamber, it might be another disappointment dressed in promising seals. The Valley of the Kings has taught caution, yet when a small opening is made and a light is raised to the darkness, the modern story of Tutankhamun begins. Carter peers inside, and at first the hot air escaping from the chamber makes the flame flicker. Shapes emerge slowly. Gold, ebony, alabaster, strange animal forms, couches, chests, dismantled chariots, objects piled and nested and pressed into shadow. The chamber is not empty. It is crowded with the afterlife. The famous words later attached to this moment have become almost inseparable from the discovery. But the deeper truth is quieter than any phrase. Carter is not simply seeing treasure. He is seeing order and disorder at once. He is seeing a royal burial that has been entered, then closed again. He is seeing objects placed with ritual intention, but also shifted, stacked, and squeezed into a small space. He is seeing a civilization's idea of eternity preserved in a room that feels almost breathless with density. Nothing about it is simple. The first chamber does not immediately reveal the mummy. It does not hand over the whole secret in one gesture. It presents a problem made of beauty. The tomb must be studied, not merely opened. That distinction matters because the discovery could easily have become only a hunt for gold. Instead, Carter insists on method. The objects are photographed, recorded, stabilized, numbered, and removed with painstaking care. The process will take years. Each item carries information beyond its material value: where it stood, how it was packed, whether it had been disturbed, what inscriptions it bore, what signs of repair or reuse it carried. A chest can reveal royal names. A jar can reveal offerings. A chariot can speak to ceremony, hunting, mobility, and kingship. A sealed shrine can indicate that deeper rooms remain. Even empty spaces matter, because they show where ancient hands had once moved something away. For the people standing there in November 1922, the feeling must have been difficult to contain. They are not merely entering a hidden room. They are crossing from modern Egypt into a carefully constructed world of the dead, a world sealed while the Bronze Age still lived and reopened in an age of cameras, newspapers, and global fascination. Outside, the valley remains harsh and sunlit. Inside, the air belongs to another time. The guardians have not yet been fully seen. The burial chamber has not yet yielded its nested shrines. The golden mask still lies deeper in the story, behind layers of ritual protection. But the first glimpse is enough. The young king, nearly erased from history, has returned through a crack in a sealed door. The first chamber of Tutankhamun's tomb does not look like the grand, orderly resting place of a ruler who expected history to admire him. It looks almost like eternity has been packed in a hurry. Objects lean against one another. Chariot parts rise from the crowded darkness like the bones of some golden machine. Couches with animal heads stand on long legs, their forms both elegant and strange, as if creatures from the sacred imagination have gathered to guard the dead. Boxes, jars, stools, beds, baskets, and carved pieces of furniture fill the space so thickly that the room seems less like an open chamber than a sealed thought. It is not empty enough to be majestic in the usual way. It is overwhelming because it is full of things made by hands, chosen by priests, touched by servants, carried by workmen, sealed by officials, disturbed by robbers, restored by those responsible for protecting the royal dead, and then abandoned to darkness for more than 3,000 years. This is why Tutankhamun's tomb becomes unlike any other discovery in Egypt. It is not the largest royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It is not the most beautifully painted in every chamber. Its plan is modest compared with those of greater rulers, and its decorated burial chamber is surprisingly small for a pharaoh. If someone had described it only by architecture, without mentioning the contents, it might have seemed almost disappointing. The corridors are limited. The rooms are few. The walls do not unfold into endless painted underworld books like the tombs of more powerful kings. Yet what it lacks in scale, it preserves in intimacy. The tomb does not show Egypt at its most monumental. It shows Egypt at its most concentrated. Most royal tombs in the valley had been robbed in antiquity. Some were stripped with ruthless efficiency. Gold vanished. Coffins were broken or removed. Mummies were relocated, unwrapped, damaged, or hidden in later caches by priests trying to rescue royal bodies from further violation. Over time, the great tombs became wounded documents. Their walls remained, but much of the portable world that once filled them disappeared. Tutankhamun's tomb is different because so much of that portable world survives. It gives archaeology something rare, not merely the shell of a burial, but a dense collection of the things a royal court believed a king needed beyond death. The objects are not just beautiful, they are evidence of a complete ritual imagination. A tomb in ancient Egypt is never simply a place to put a body. It is a carefully organized threshold between worlds. The dead king is not meant to remain an inert corpse. He is meant to be transformed, protected, revived, and joined to divine cycles larger than ordinary human life. The sun disappears into the west and returns in the east. Osiris dies and lives again in a different form. The body is preserved because identity must endure. The name is written because memory has power. Food is provided because the afterlife is imagined with needs. Amulets are placed because dangers continue beyond the grave. Statues and images act as magical substitutes, protectors, and vessels of presence. The tomb is architecture, treasury, ritual chamber, and cosmic machine all at once. Tutankhamun's burial lets the modern world see this system not as an abstract belief, but as a physical arrangement. The antechamber holds furniture and equipment. The burial chamber contains the nested shrines, sarcophagus, coffins, and mummy. A treasury holds sacred objects, including the canopic shrine connected to the preservation of internal organs. Another small room, often called the annex, contains food, oils, vessels, and other supplies. Packed in a way that suggests both abundance and pressure, each space has its role, though the exact history of how some objects entered the tomb remains debated. Some pieces may have been made originally for Tutankhamun. Others appear to have been adapted, reinscribed, or repurposed. What survives in the record suggests that his burial drew on existing royal workshops, available materials, and perhaps objects prepared under complicated political circumstances. That possibility makes the tomb even more revealing. It is tempting to imagine every treasure as perfectly designed for one king, planned calmly over many years. But Tutankhamun died young. An ancient royal burial required speed as well as ceremony. The Egyptians had fixed expectations about mummification, ritual timing, and burial preparation. A sudden death could create pressure. Objects might be gathered quickly. Some items might be reused from earlier royal burials or altered from possessions connected to other members of the Amarna family. Scholars still debate the details of reuse, especially where inscriptions and style complicate the story. But the tomb itself gives the impression of a court determined to complete the necessary transformation, even if circumstances were less than ideal. The result is a burial that feels both royal and improvised. The wealth is astonishing, but the rooms are cramped. The ritual intention is clear, but the arrangement is crowded. The king is surrounded by a universe of protective gold, divine forms, and sacred texts. Yet the tomb's modest scale hints that this may not have been the grand resting place originally imagined for him. Some scholars have proposed that the tomb may have been adapted from a non-royal or less ambitious burial space, though not every detail is settled. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. What matters for the story is the tension Tutankhamun receives the full symbolic treatment of kingship inside a tomb that seems unexpectedly small for the ruler of Egypt. This contrast is one reason the discovery grips the world so strongly. The tomb does not present a distant, abstract king surrounded only by formal grandeur. It presents a person buried with layers of public theology and private practicality. The golden mask belongs to eternity, but the sandals belong to walking. The nested shrines belong to divine kingship, but the linen garments belong to a body. The guardian statues stand in ritual stillness, but the storage boxes suggest the work of people packing, sorting, closing, and sealing. There are weapons and chariots that speak of royal imagery and elite identity. There are games that suggest leisure. There are containers for oils and unguents, some of which must once have filled the tomb with scent before time changed them into darker residues. There are walking sticks in notable number, a detail that has helped fuel discussion about the king's health, mobility, and royal symbolism. Even here, caution is necessary. A pharaoh's staff may be practical, ceremonial, or both, and the evidence does not allow every object to be interpreted in only one way. The tomb also preserves the labour of the living. Behind every dazzling object stands a chain of people whose names are mostly gone. Woodworkers shape imported and local materials into beds, chairs, boxes, and shrines. Metal workers hammer gold into thin sheets and fit them over surfaces with extraordinary skill. Artists paint scenes of divine protection. Scribes prepare inscriptions that bind the king's name to eternity. Embalmers perform rites that turn the body into a sacred form. Priests speak formulas that guide the transformation. Officials inspect seals. Guards and workmen close the entrance. The tomb is famous because of Tutankhamun, but it survives as a monument to a society's collective work around death. And then there is the strange fact that this crowded tomb, which seems to hold so much, also proves how much has vanished from every other royal burial. If this is what survives from a relatively minor and short-reigned king, what did the tombs of the greatest pharaohs once contain before robbers entered them? What might have surrounded Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Seti I, or Rameses II in their first sealed darkness? Tutankhamun's burial becomes a kind of ghostly measuring tool. It shows not only what was found, but what had been lost elsewhere. The small tomb opens a window onto a vast absence. That is the deeper wonder of the discovery. It is not merely that gold survived. It is that a whole arrangement of belief, politics, craftsmanship, urgency, and accident survived together. The tomb is a preserved moment from a civilization that expected eternity, yet depended on fragile human actions to reach it. It is both magnificent and vulnerable. These sealed rooms contain a king, but they also contain the anxiety of those who buried him, the fingerprints of a court recovering from religious upheaval, and the quiet evidence of ancient officials trying to repair a violation after robbers had already slipped inside. In the end, Tutankhamun's tomb is not unlike the young king himself, smaller than legend suggests, more complicated than the gold implies, and powerful because history nearly lost him. Behind the golden mask, the person becomes harder to see. The mask is so familiar now that it almost works against him. It gives Tutankhamun an eternal face, calm and symmetrical, with inlaid eyes, smooth skin, a royal false beard, and the striped Nemes headdress of kingship. It is not a portrait in the modern sense. It is not trying to capture a passing expression, a private mood, or the exact look of a young ruler in a palace corridor. It is an image of transformation, a face made for the afterlife, designed to identify the dead king with divine permanence. The gold does not age, the eyes do not tire, the mouth does not reveal fear, pain, uncertainty, or youth. And so the world knows the mask more easily than the boy. Tutankhamun comes to the throne at a fragile moment, probably around the age of 8 or 9, though exact ages in ancient records are rarely as tidy as modern biography would like. He rules for roughly a decade and dies before reaching full adulthood, most likely around 18 or 19. That short life creates the central difficulty in understanding him. He is old enough to be a king in ritual, old enough to be represented in scenes of authority, hunting, worship, and victory. Yet he is young enough that much of the state must have been guided by older officials, priests, military men, and palace insiders. Egypt presents him as pharaoh because Egypt needs a pharaoh. Whether Tutankhamun himself directs policy in any meaningful personal way remains uncertain, especially in the earlier years of his reign. Scholars still debate how much power he actually exercised, and how much authority flowed through him rather than from him. Even his name preserves a political story. He was not born as Tutankhamun, or at least he was not first known by that form. Earlier in life he appears as Tutankhaten, a name connected to the Aten, the solar disk elevated during the reign of Akhenaten. Later, as Egypt turns away from Akhenaten's religious experiment and restores the older cults, especially that of Amun, the young king's name changes to Tutankhamun, often understood as the living image of Amun. A name in ancient Egypt is not a casual label. It is identity, theology, legitimacy, and public message. The change signals more than personal devotion. It announces that the royal house is moving back toward the religious world Akhenaten had disrupted. In one young body, Egypt attempts to heal a wound in its divine order. His family background leads into one of the most tangled parts of New Kingdom history. Tutankhamun belongs to the Amarna royal family, the line of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their circle, where art, religion, politics, and royal identity become unusually charged. Genetic studies have suggested that Tutankhamun was likely the son of Akhenaten, and a woman whose mummy has been identified genetically as a close relative of Akhenaten, possibly his full sister, though the exact personal identity of that woman remains debated. This is one of those places where modern science clarifies the family tree and complicates the human story at the same time. DNA can suggest biological relationships, but it cannot restore a lost name with complete certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because royal mummies have complex histories of movement, damage, and identification. The mother of Tutankhamun is not the glamorous figure popular imagination often wants her to be. Many people have wished to connect him directly to Nefertiti, because Nefertiti herself is wrapped in mystery and beauty, her painted bust almost as iconic as Tutankhamun's mask. But the strongest genetic interpretation does not support Nefertiti as his biological mother, unless future evidence changes the picture in ways not currently demonstrated. That difference between desire and evidence matters. Ancient Egypt is often pulled into modern storytelling, where famous names attract each other like magnets. The real record is less obedient. It leaves empty spaces where certainty would be satisfying. It allows relationships to be inferred, tested, challenged, and revised, but not always resolved. Tutankhamun's marriage also reflects the tense dynastic world around him. He was married to Akhenaten, a royal woman usually understood as a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and therefore closely connected to the same family upheaval. Their union helped preserve royal legitimacy in a court where bloodline, divine status, and political continuity mattered intensely. In the tomb, 2 tiny mummified female fetuses were found, often interpreted as the stillborn daughters of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten. Their presence is a quiet, lesser-known detail that changes the emotional texture of the burial without needing dramatic invention. They were placed with the king, suggesting a family hope or royal connection carried into the afterlife. It is important to speak of them gently and without speculation beyond the evidence. What survives in the record suggests a royal household where succession may have been uncertain, and where the king died without a living heir to secure the line. That lack of a clear heir has enormous consequences. A young pharaoh's death is never just a private tragedy in ancient Egypt. It is a crisis of cosmic and political order. The king is the bridge between gods and people, the living guarantor of Mat, the principle of balance, truth, and right order. When he dies, the rituals can transform him into an Osirian king of the dead, but the living throne must also be filled. Without an obvious son, power begins to move through older hands. Figures such as Ai and Horemheb stand near the end of the Amarna period, both associated with the transition after Tutankhamun. Their later roles suggest that the boy king's reign sits between religious repair and political consolidation. Tutankhamun's life becomes the narrow passage through which Egypt moves out of the Amarna shadow. And yet, if one strips away the gold, the politics, and the later fame, there remains a young person raised inside a world almost impossible for modern people to imagine. From childhood, Tutankhamun would have been surrounded by ceremony. His body, clothing, movements, and public images were tied to kingship. He may have learned to shoot, hunt, ride in chariots, perform rituals, receive officials, and appear before the court as the divine son of a line that had nearly overturned Egypt's religious foundations. But the ordinary texture of his life is mostly lost. We can see the furniture, the sandals, the board games, the linen, the weapons, the painted scenes, but not his voice. We can examine his bones and teeth, but not his thoughts. We can read names and titles, but not the private fear or confidence of a young ruler standing in the wake of a revolution he did not create. This is why the phrase boy king is both useful and dangerous. It reminds us of his youth, the shortness of his life, the strangeness of such authority placed on someone so young, but it can also make him seem like a passive ornament, a child-shaped symbol carried by others. The truth was likely more complicated. As he grew older, Tutankhamun may have become more aware of his role in restoring older traditions and stabilizing the court. He may have participated in ceremonies with increasing confidence. He may have developed preferences, loyalties, fears, and habits that the record no longer preserves. No single explanation fully accounts for how a young king experiences power in such a system. He's both person and institution, both adolescent and pharaoh, both living body and sacred image. The golden mask freezes one answer and hides the rest. It gives the world a perfect royal face, but it cannot tell us whether Tutankhamun was shy, proud, anxious, gentle, stubborn, ill, hopeful, or lonely. It cannot tell us how he felt about the gods whose names had shaped his own identity, or about the family crisis that placed him on the throne. It cannot tell us whether he understood how close his dynasty stood to erasure. The mask survives because it is gold. The boy behind it survives only in fragments: a changed name, a damaged body, a crowded tomb, a short reign, a vanished court, and a fame that came far too late to be of any use to him. To understand Tutankhamun, it is necessary to enter the strange brightness left behind by Akhenaten. It is a world of sun-drenched courtyards, open-air temples, unfinished reforms, wounded priesthoods, changed names, erased gods, and a royal family placed under the glare of a single divine disk. The Egypt Tutankhamun inherits is not a calm kingdom moving smoothly from one pharaoh to another. It is a country recovering from an experiment that had reached into the deepest parts of its identity. For generations, Egypt's religious life has been crowded, layered, and richly local. Amun of Thebes, Ptah of Memphis, Ra of Heliopolis, Osiris, Isis, Hathor, Thoth, Anubis, and many others filled the temples, festivals, funerary texts, household hopes, and state rituals. The gods were not merely ideas, they were institutions, economies, lands, workshops, priesthoods, calendars, and sources of royal legitimacy. Then Akhenaten elevated the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, with a force that disturbed the balance of that older world. Akhenaten did not simply add a devotion to the Aten on top of existing traditions. He shifted the royal centre of gravity. He changed his own name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, moving away from Amun and toward the Aten. He built a new capital at Akhenaten, the place known today as Amarna, on a stretch of desert plain between cliffs and river. The city rose quickly, with palaces, temples, administrative buildings, workers' areas, boundary stelae, and spaces designed for the new royal vision. Unlike the dark and closed sanctuaries of older temples, Aten worship emphasized open light. The sun's rays descend in art like hands reaching toward the royal family, ending in tiny ankhs of life. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters appear with unusual intimacy and prominence, their bodies shown in an artistic style that still unsettles modern viewers because it refuses the older ideals of rigid royal perfection. Long faces, narrow limbs, swelling forms, and scenes of family closeness replace the more timeless muscular distance of earlier kingship. Yet beauty in art does not mean peace in politics. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that Akhenaten's revolution created deep disruption. Temples connected to other gods, especially Amun, lost status. Divine names were attacked or erased in some contexts. The old priesthoods and temple economies must have felt the pressure, because temples were not only spiritual centers, they were engines of wealth, employment, landholding, craft production, storage, and redistribution. To weaken a god was also to weaken a network of people. An Egyptian farmer, artisan, soldier, priest, or official did not experience religion as a private belief separate from public life. The gods were woven through the practical order of the kingdom. When that order shifted too sharply, the consequences could reach far beyond theology. Tutankhamun enters history in the aftermath. He does not create the revolution, but he is used to end it. As a very young king, he becomes the living instrument of restoration. His early name, Tutankhaten, belongs to the Aten world. His later name, Tutankhamun, announces a return to Amun. The change is not small. It is a public correction, a royal signal that Egypt is turning back toward older divine powers. The court also leaves the Amarna world behind. The precise sequence of residences and decisions is still debated, but the center of power shifts away from Akhenaten, and older sacred cities regain importance. Thebes, with its great cult of Amun, rises again in religious meaning, while Memphis may have played an important administrative role. The abandoned Amarna city becomes one of the most haunting archaeological landscapes in Egypt, a capital built for a vision that did not last, its mud brick walls returning to dust, its carved fragments scattered, its theology later treated as an embarrassment. The restoration, stela associated with Tutankhamun, gives the official voice of repair. It describes temples fallen into neglect, sanctuaries damaged, divine images needing restoration, and gods turning away because their houses had been ignored. Like all royal inscriptions, it must be read carefully. It is political theology, not neutral reporting. It tells the story the new regime once told, that disorder had entered the land and that the young king, guided by proper divine favour, restored Mut. Still, the message is powerful. Egypt's problem is framed as a cosmic imbalance, and Tutankhamun is presented as the one who repairs it. He restores temple personnel, rebuilds cult places, and renews offerings. Whether the boy himself directs these policies or whether powerful advisors shape them in his name remains uncertain. In practice, the distinction may have mattered less to the public than the visible result. The pharaoh's name stands on the act. The god receives honor again. The state declares itself healed. One of the lesser-known consequences of this period is the later attempt to compress or erase the Amarna kings from official memory. Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and I become awkward figures in later king lists, with Horemheb and subsequent rulers presenting themselves as restoring a cleaner continuity. In some official reckonings, the years of the Amarna rulers could be absorbed into Horemheb's reign, as if history itself were being repaired by omission. This is not simple forgetfulness, it is controlled memory. Ancient Egypt cared deeply about names, images, and continuity. To erase a king's name was not merely to edit a record, it was to damage his presence in eternity. Tutankhamun's later obscurity may have helped protect his tomb, but in its own time it also reflects the discomfort surrounding the period from which he came. This is the political world behind the golden burial. Tutankhamun is not just a young king with treasure, he is a hinge between a radical sacred experiment and the restoration of a traditional order. Around him stand people who understand the stakes, priests of Amun, eager to regain wealth and honor, officials who need stable administration, military men concerned with Egypt's borders and influence, artists and scribes adapting royal language, and courtiers whose survival depends on reading the direction of power correctly. The empire outside Egypt has not paused politely while the court debated theology. Letters from the broader Amarna age reveal anxieties about diplomacy, vassal rulers, and foreign affairs in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Scholars still debate how far Akhenaten's religious focus weakened Egypt's international position, but the sense of strain in the period is difficult to ignore. Tutankhamun's reign, then, becomes a performance of normality after abnormality. The old gods return. The young king appears before Amun. Traditional artistic forms regain ground. Royal names are adjusted. Temples receive attention. The court moves away from the city of the Aten. Yet the repair is not instant, and it is probably not clean. A religious system cannot be shaken and then restored without scars. Workshops must change inscriptions. Officials must decide which names to honor and which to avoid. Priests must re-establish routines. The royal family must detach itself from a recent past that is also its own bloodline. Tutankhamun is descended from the very world his reign is expected to correct. That contradiction gives his story its quiet tension. He is both heir to Akhenaten and symbol of Akhenaten's reversal. His body belongs to the Amarna family, but his restored name belongs to Amun. His tomb contains objects shaped by the artistic and political atmosphere of a troubled court, but his burial insists on traditional afterlife power. No single explanation fully accounts for how this transition felt to those living through it. To some, it may have seemed like salvation. To others, caution. To others, simply another turn in the dangerous weather of royal favor. In the center stands Tutankhamun, young, sacred, and useful, carrying a burden larger than his years. By the time he dies, Egypt has begun to move past the Aten's long glare, but the shadow of that revolution still falls across his tomb, his name, his family, and the mystery that waits behind every glittering object buried with him. If Tutankhamun's public life is preserved in names, stelae, and ritual scenes, his private world survives more quietly in wood, linen, leather, ivory, stone, and dust. The tomb does not give us his daily schedule. It does not allow anyone to stand beside him in a palace courtyard, or follow him through the cool interior of a royal residence. But it does preserve objects that once belonged to the language of living, and through them the boy behind the mask becomes less abstract. Egypt's kingship was divine, but a pharaoh still sat, ate, dressed, moved, rested, learned ceremonies, handled objects, and was surrounded by people whose work made royal life possible. In the crowded chambers of the tomb, the afterlife is furnished with traces of the palace. What was meant to serve eternity also becomes the closest modern archaeology can come to the texture of his days. Royal life in the late 18th dynasty was not simple luxury. It was performance. Every visible detail of the king's body and surroundings carried meaning. A throne was not merely a chair. A fan was not merely a tool against heat. A staff was not merely a support. Chariots, bows, sandals, collars, linen garments, cosmetic vessels, and carved boxes all moved within a world where status, ritual, comfort, and symbolism overlapped. Tutankhamun's tomb preserves this overlap almost everywhere. A piece may have been practical in life, ceremonial in court, magical in death, or all three at once. That is why interpretation must remain careful. The evidence remains incomplete, and the presence of an object in a tomb does not always prove how often it was used in daily life. Still, the collection lets us glimpse what the royal household considered necessary, meaningful, familiar, or powerful enough to accompany the king beyond death. One of the most intimate objects is the golden throne. Its beauty is obvious, but its scene is more revealing than its brightness. Tutankhamun sits while Akhenaten stands before him, touching or anointing him in a domestic royal moment beneath the rays of the sun disk. The style still carries the softness and intimacy of the Amarna world, even as the king's later identity belongs to the restoration of Amun. This single object seems to hold the political tension of his reign. The royal couple shone with warmth and closeness, the Aten's rays above them, and the throne later adjusted with the names that mark the movement away from Aten-centered rule. It is not just furniture, it is a surviving argument between past and present, between family memory and official correction. What survives in the record suggests that the court did not simply throw away the Amarna world overnight. It altered, adapted, and lived with its remains. Tutankhamun's clothing and ornaments also speak to the body beneath the royal image. The tomb contained fine linen, sandals, gloves, collars, pectorals, rings, and other items that show the care given to appearance and identity. Linen was central to Egyptian life, from ordinary garments to priestly purity and burial wrapping. For a king, it could be light enough for Egypt's climate, and refined enough to express rank. Sandals, some elaborately decorated, remind us that royal feet were themselves symbolic, especially when images of enemies appeared beneath them as a statement of domination. Yet sandals are also human objects. They belong to walking, standing, procession, and bodily presence. A pharaoh is divine in ideology, but the ideology still needs feet. The many walking sticks found in the tomb have drawn particular attention. Some are elegant, some ceremonial, some perhaps connected to real mobility. Modern studies of Tutankhamun's body have encouraged discussion about whether he experienced difficulty walking, and the sticks seem to invite that conclusion. But no single explanation fully accounts for the collection. Staves were also signs of authority, elite identity, and formal display. Egyptian officials and nobles could be shown holding staffs without implying disability. In Tutankhamun's case, both possibilities may matter. Some sticks may have been symbols of rank, others familiar supports, and others placed there because the afterlife required completeness. The surprising detail is not simply their number, but the way they blur the line between royal emblem and physical need. There are also games, including board games associated with leisure and the passage through fate. The game of Senet, known from Egyptian contexts over many centuries, could be entertainment, but it also developed funerary meaning, linked to movement through the afterlife. In life, such a game may have passed time in palace rooms. In death, it may have symbolized a deeper journey. The same object can shift from amusement to ritual without losing either identity. This is one reason Tutankhamun's tomb feels so alive. The afterlife equipment is not purely solemn. It contains forms of pleasure, taste, scent, skill, and memory. A king's eternity required not only spells and shrines, but also the familiar rhythms of elite existence. Food and drink offerings extend that rhythm. Jars, baskets, and containers point to provisions for the dead king, including wine, oils, and foodstuffs that once belonged to a sensory world now mostly vanished. Wine jars could carry labels giving vineyards, dates, or quality, turning a burial good into an administrative record. Oils and unguents, some imported or costly, connected the body to fragrance, ritual purity, medicine, and luxury. In the sealed tomb, these substances changed over time. What had once been aromatic became residue, darkened material, chemical trace. The palace life they evoke was not only visual, it was scented with oils, warmed by lamps, brightened by polished surfaces, and shaped by the movement of attendants through rooms where every object had its place. Weapons and chariots add another layer. Tutankhamun's tomb contained bows, arrows, shields, daggers, and chariot equipment, including several chariots placed in the antechamber and elsewhere. These objects present the king as hunter, warrior, and master of movement. Whether Tutankhamun personally rode and hunted with vigor throughout his short life remains debated, especially given questions about his health. But royal imagery required the pharaoh to be shown as strong, victorious, and capable of controlling chaos. Hunting scenes were not simply sport, they could symbolize order imposed on the wild. Weapons in a royal tomb were practical, ceremonial, and ideological. A particularly famous iron dagger found with the mummy became one of the tomb's more surprising details because iron was rare and prestigious in Egypt at the time, and later analysis has suggested meteoritic origin for its metal. Even a small blade can carry the sky into the burial chamber. Palace life also included education in rule. Tutankhamun would have been surrounded by scribes, tutors, priests, commanders, and officials who trained him in the gestures and knowledge of kingship. He did not need to be a scholar in the modern sense to perform royal authority, but he had to inhabit a role dense with tradition. He had to appear in ritual contexts, receive offerings, honor gods, and stand at the center of ceremonies designed to renew order. His day would have been shaped by others' attendants dressing him, priests preparing rites, officials presenting matters of state, craftspeople maintaining royal equipment, and guards regulating access. The king's privacy, if he had much of it, was still encircled by service and symbolism. Yet the objects in his tomb also suggest comfort. Beds, headrests, boxes, chairs, and containers create the outline of a refined domestic world. Egyptian headrests can seem uncomfortable to modern eyes, but they were common and meaningful, supporting the head during sleep and carrying protective associations. The tomb's beds and couches, some shaped with animal forms, bring the royal body into contact with divine protection. A palace bed becomes an afterlife bed. A chair becomes a throne of eternity. A storage box becomes a sealed memory. The dead king is supplied not as a ghostly abstraction, but as someone expected to continue in recognizable form. This is perhaps the most moving truth hidden beneath the splendor. The people who buried Tutankhamun did not imagine him floating away into pure symbol. They gave him things. They gave him clothes, oils, food, weapons, games, staffs, beds, chariots, ornaments, and protective figures. They surrounded him with a version of the world he knew, transformed by theology but still rooted in daily life. The palace follows him into the tomb, not perfectly and not completely, but densely enough that modern eyes can reconstruct its outlines. In the end, Tutankhamun's daily life remains unreachable, but the objects placed around him show what his world valued display: order, scent, movement, protection, restoration, and the hope that even a short life could be furnished for forever. At the center of all the gold, beneath shrines, coffins, linen, resin, amulets, and ritual language, there is finally a body. This is the point where Tutankhamun becomes most real and most difficult to understand. The tomb dazzles outwardly, but the mummy pulls the story inward, toward bone, skin, teeth, damage, preservation, and the quiet limits of science. The golden mask gives him an immortal face, but the body beneath it is fragile, darkened, altered by embalming, affected by heat and chemistry, and changed further by the act of discovery itself. Ancient Egypt tried to defeat decay through ritual and craft. Modern researchers try to read what decay has left behind. Between those two efforts lies the young king's physical truth, incomplete and stubborn, refusing to become as clear as legend wants it to be. When Carter's team reached the burial chamber and began the long work of opening the nested shrines and coffins, the process was not simple revelation. It was careful, tense, and technically difficult. The mummy had been enclosed inside a series of protective layers, gilded shrines surrounding a stone sarcophagus. Within it, coffins, and within them the wrapped royal body. The innermost coffin of solid gold became one of the most astonishing objects ever found in Egypt. But the mummy inside presented a problem almost immediately. The embalming materials, especially dark resinous substances poured or applied during the burial ritual, had hardened over time. They acted as sacred protection, but also as an adhesive. The king's body was effectively stuck within the coffin. To remove and examine it, Carter's team used methods that modern conservation would not choose, including heat and cutting through wrappings. It is easy to judge this harshly now, and some damage was certainly done, but the moment also belongs to an earlier stage of archaeology, when scientific methods, conservation ethics, and the understanding of fragile organic remains were very different from today. The condition of the mummy has shaped every later debate. Tutankhamun's body is not a perfectly preserved medical document waiting to be read like a hospital chart. It is a royal mummy altered by embalming, ancient chemical reactions, pressure, resin, handling, separation of parts, and modern examination. His remains were damaged in antiquity by the funerary process, and in modern times by efforts to free and study them. This means that every claim about his appearance, health, and death must be weighed against what the body can and cannot reliably show. The evidence remains incomplete not because researchers have failed to look, but because the record itself is physically compromised. The mummy is evidence, but it is not a simple answer. Still, the body has revealed important clues. Tutankhamun was not a giant warrior king in the way royal propaganda often imagined pharaohs. He was a young male, likely in his late teens at death. Studies of his bones and teeth support the view that he died before full maturity, though old enough to have reigned for years and to have passed through adolescence into the threshold of adulthood. Attempts to reconstruct his appearance suggest a slender young man with features consistent with his family line. But such reconstructions must be treated cautiously. A face built from a skull is not the same as a living face. It cannot restore expression, movement, skin tone with certainty, or the subtle human presence that made a person recognizable. What survives in the record suggests a young royal body, not the fully knowable person behind it. Modern imaging has encouraged discussion about Tutankhamun's health. CT scans and other examinations have identified several features that may point to physical difficulties, including issues involving the foot. Some studies have suggested that he may have had a clubfoot or other abnormalities affecting his walking, and this has often been connected to the many walking sticks found in the tomb. The idea is tempting because it links body and burial goods in a vivid way. The young king surrounded by staffs not only as symbols of authority, but perhaps as familiar supports. Yet caution is necessary. Royal staffs were also ceremonial objects, and ancient kingship loved the image of the ruler holding a staff as a sign of control and status. No single explanation fully accounts for the number and variety of sticks. The body may show real physical challenges, but the objects around him also belong to the symbolic language of power. Other medical clues are equally debated. Genetic studies have suggested close family relationships among Tutankhamun's ancestors, which may have increased the risk of inherited conditions. Some researchers have proposed that he suffered from multiple health problems, while others caution that popular descriptions sometimes exaggerate the evidence and turn a medically complex young man into a caricature of weakness. This matters because the modern world often swings between extremes, either the golden king as perfect beauty, or the fragile king as a bundle of illnesses. The more grounded picture is less dramatic and more human. Tutankhamun may have had physical vulnerabilities. He may have experienced mobility issues. He may have carried genetic burdens from a tightly intermarried royal family. But he was also a functioning pharaoh, represented in ritual, equipped for royal identity, and buried with objects that express strength, divinity, and continuity. The body complicates the image, it does not erase it. One of the most famous earlier theories about his death involved a blow to the head. For a time, damage visible in examinations helped fuel speculation that Tutankhamun had been murdered. The image was irresistible: a young king, a dangerous court, ambitious successors, a suspicious injury, and a tomb sealed in haste. But later study has made that simple murder story much less secure. Some cranial damage is now often understood as post-mortem, connected to mummification or later handling, rather than clear evidence of a fatal attack. Scholars still debate details of trauma and preservation, but the older dramatic certainty has faded. The skull does not plainly confess an assassination. Ancient politics could be ruthless, but archaeology cannot convict someone simply because a story feels satisfying. More attention has turned to the lower body, especially a fracture of the left thigh bone identified in modern examinations. Some have suggested that this injury may have occurred shortly before death and could have led to infection or complications. Others have questioned whether the break happened before death, during embalming, during Carter's extraction, or through later damage. The distinction is crucial. A fracture with signs of healing or biological response can tell a different story from a clean break after death. But the mummy's condition makes certainty difficult. If the injury was fresh before death, it might fit with a sudden accident, perhaps involving a fall or chariot-related incident, though such scenarios remain speculative. If it occurred after death, it tells us more about damage to the mummy than about the king's final days. The evidence does not allow an easy verdict. Disease adds another layer. Studies have reported evidence consistent with malaria infection in Tutankhamun and related mummies, raising the possibility that malaria may have contributed to his death, especially if he was already weakened by other conditions or injury. In ancient Egypt, the Nile environment could support mosquitoes, and malaria may have been a real threat. But finding traces of infection does not automatically prove cause of death. A person can carry evidence of disease without that disease being the final killer. The most careful interpretation is that Tutankhamun may have died from a combination of factors rather than one dramatic event: possible infection, possible injury, inherited vulnerabilities, and the unpredictable dangers of life before modern medicine. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and that uncertainty is part of why the mystery endures. The mummy also reveals the ambitions and limits of ancient embalming. Tutankhamun's body was prepared to become eternal, but the process was not gentle in the modern sense. Organs were removed and preserved according to Egyptian funerary practice. The body was dried, anointed, wrapped, filled with amulets, and transformed into a sacred being. The heavy use of resins may have had ritual and preservative purposes, though it contributed to later damage. The embalmers were not trying to preserve a body for medical study. They were creating a divine, protected form capable of surviving the dangers of the afterlife. In that sense, the mummy is not only a biological object, it is a ritual artifact, shaped by theology as much as anatomy. To stand imaginatively before Tutankhamun's mummy is to feel the entire story narrow to its most vulnerable point. The court could restore Amun, artists could cover wood in gold, priests could recite powerful formulas, officials could seal doors. But at the centre was a young body that had stopped living, and all the wealth of Egypt was arranged around that fact. The golden coffin did not hide death. It answered it. The mask did not deny fragility. It transformed it. Modern science has brought lights, scanners, measurements, and genetic analysis into the darkness Carter opened. Yet the king remains partly beyond reach. His bones offer clues. His burial offers context. His age gives the mystery urgency. But the body in the gold coffin still keeps some of its silence, as if the desert has not surrendered everything after all. The death of Tutankhamun has always invited a story sharper than the evidence allows. A young king dies before his life has properly unfolded. His dynasty stands in a difficult place. Older men wait near the throne. A queen is left without a living heir. The burial seems crowded and possibly hurried. Later, history folds his reign into a period many Egyptians would rather smooth over or forget. It is almost too easy for the modern imagination to turn these pieces into a clean plot, with a victim, a suspect, a weapon, and a motive waiting in the shadows of the palace. But ancient death rarely arranges itself so neatly. In Tutankhamun's case, the closer scholars look, the more the mystery changes shape. The question is no longer simply whether he was murdered, injured, sick, or genetically vulnerable. The harder question is how all these possibilities fit together inside a body and a court that cannot fully speak. For much of the 20th century, the most dramatic explanation was assassination. It suited the atmosphere surrounding the tomb. The discovery had already become a global spectacle, wrapped in gold, secrecy, and rumours of curses. A young pharaoh dying suddenly at the edge of adulthood seemed like a historical thriller waiting to be solved. Early examinations of the mummy noted damage to the skull, and that damage was transformed in popular imagination into the fatal blow of a palace conspiracy. The suspects practically wrote themselves. The older courtier who soon became king, had proximity and opportunity, Horemheb, the powerful military figure who later ruled Egypt and helped to raise the Amarna line, had ambition and influence. Akhenaten's later uncertain fate added still more drama. The story felt compelling because it was human, dangerous, and simple. Yet simplicity is often the first thing archaeology takes away. Later study has made the head injury murder theory much less convincing. Damage to the skull appears more likely to have occurred after death, either during mummification, ancient handling, or modern efforts to examine the remains. The evidence remains incomplete, but the skull does not clearly preserve the mark of a fatal attack. This does not prove that no political danger surrounded Tutankhamun. The end of the Amarna period was unstable, and royal succession without a living heir could be a perilous matter. But political possibility is not the same as forensic proof. Ancient Egypt knew intrigue, rivalry, and ruthless memory. It also knew fever, infection, accidents, and diseases that could carry away even a king covered in gold. Once the murder theory weakens, the mystery becomes less theatrical but more interesting. Tutankhamun may have died because several vulnerabilities converged. A young person in the ancient world could survive many discomforts and still be vulnerable to one severe infection, one untreated injury, one fever, one complication that modern medicine would likely manage quickly. The king's body has been examined with modern imaging, and researchers have debated the significance of damage to the left leg, especially a fracture of the thigh bone. If that injury happened before death, it could have been dangerous. A broken femur in the ancient world was not merely painful, it could lead to blood loss, shock, infection, immobility, and cascading physical decline. If the fracture occurred after death, however, it tells a very different story, perhaps related to embalming damage, ancient disturbance, or modern extraction. The line between injury in life and damage after death is one of the most important and difficult lines in the entire case. The idea of a chariot accident has often grown from this evidence. Tutankhamun was buried with chariots, and royal imagery loved to present kings as masters of speed, hunting, and controlled violence against chaos. A young pharaoh thrown from a chariot or crushed in an accident would fit the drama of sudden death. It would also explain a severe leg injury if that injury was truly fresh. But here again, caution matters. Chariots in the tomb do not prove the manner of death. They belong to kingship, mobility, prestige, and afterlife equipment. A royal burial needed symbols of power whether the king used them daily or only ceremonially. Scholars still debate the fracture, and no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The accident theory remains possible, but not proven. It is a scenario, not a verdict. Disease may have played an equally important role, perhaps a greater one. Modern studies have found evidence interpreted as malaria infection in Tutankhamun and some related royal mummies in the Nile Valley, where water, seasonal flooding, irrigation, and settlement patterns created environments favorable to mosquitoes, malaria could have been a serious presence. For a young king already weakened by injury or inherited conditions, malaria might have become life-threatening. But infection evidence is not the same as a death certificate. People can carry traces of a disease without dying from it at the moment those traces are detected. The most careful reading is that malaria may have been part of the picture, perhaps one pressure among several. In the ancient world, death often came not as one clean cause, but as a chain. The chain may have begun before Tutankhamun was born. Royal families in ancient Egypt often practiced close-kin marriage to preserve dynastic legitimacy, divine bloodline, and political control. Such marriages could reinforce claims to the throne, but they could also increase the chance of inherited health problems. Genetic research has suggested that Tutankhamun's parents were closely related, possibly siblings or near siblings. This has encouraged theories that the young king suffered from congenital conditions affecting his body, immune strength, or overall health. Some reconstructions have portrayed him as extremely frail, with a range of abnormalities, but the more responsible view is measured. He may indeed have carried genetic burdens. He may have had foot problems or other physical difficulties, but the evidence does not support turning him into a helpless figure defined only by illness. He ruled, appeared in state imagery, and was buried with the complete symbolism of active kingship. His vulnerabilities were real possibilities, not the whole of his identity. The presence of many walking sticks remains one of the most haunting details in this discussion. In a purely dramatic retelling, they become proof that Tutankhamun struggled to walk. In a purely symbolic reading, they become only signs of authority. The truth may sit between those poles. Some sticks might have supported him physically. Others might have served ritual or ceremonial roles. Others might have been personal possessions gathered into the tomb because everything associated with the king's status and body mattered after death. What survives in the record suggests a royal household attentive to both image and need. If Tutankhamun did experience pain or difficulty moving, the tomb does not present that as weakness. It transforms it into royal equipment, folded into the same eternity as gold, chariots, and sacred oils. There is another mystery in the timing of his death. Tutankhamun seems to have died unexpectedly. His tomb, modest in size and crowded in arrangement, has often been read as evidence that the burial was prepared under pressure. A pharaoh's death required ritual action within a limited period, traditionally associated with the 70 days of mummification and funerary preparation. If the king died young and without a fully prepared royal tomb, the court had to act quickly. Objects could be assembled, adapted, reinscribed, or repurposed. The burial had to make theological sense even if political circumstances were strained. The young king's death would not have allowed Egypt to pause and solve every problem elegantly. The afterlife had deadlines. That suddenness helps explain why the death feels like an unfinished sentence. Tutankhamun's reign had begun to restore older religious structures after Akhenaten's upheaval, but the work of repair was not complete. He left no living son to continue the line. Akhenaten's position became precarious. I soon became pharaoh, and after him Horemheb took power, pushing Egypt toward a more forceful rejection of the Amarna past. If Tutankhamun had lived another 20 or 30 years, the history of the late 18th dynasty might have looked very different. He might have fathered an heir, stabilized the restoration, expanded his own building program, and become more than a golden afterthought. Instead, He died at the moment when his personal agency might have begun to matter more. The most grounded answer to the mystery of his death may therefore be unsatisfying in the best historical sense. He was probably not the victim of a neatly proven murder. He was probably not killed by one cause that can be named with absolute certainty. He may have been a young man with inherited vulnerabilities, possible mobility problems, exposure to infectious disease, and perhaps a serious injury near the end of life. Any one of these could be survivable under different conditions, together. In ancient Egypt, they could become fatal. The evidence remains incomplete, and the body is too damaged, too altered, and too distant to give a final confession. And yet the uncertainty does not make the story weaker, it makes it more human. Tutankhamun's death reminds us that kingship could not protect the body from biology. Divine titles could not stop fever. Gold could not close a wound before it turned dangerous. Priests could guide a soul through the underworld, but they could not bring breath back into the lungs of a young man whose life ended too soon. Around that silence, the court built a golden answer. They wrapped him, named him, guarded him, sealed him, and placed him among the things he would need to live again. They could not explain his death to the future. They could only prepare him for eternity. The tomb's smallness becomes more suggestive once Tutankhamun's death is understood as sudden. A pharaoh could spend years preparing a royal tomb, ordering craftsmen, shaping corridors, planning decorations, and filling chambers with objects that matched the full dignity of kingship. But Tutankhamun does not receive a vast underworld palace like some of the great rulers buried nearby. His tomb is compact, with only a few rooms, and its contents are pressed into the available space with almost uncomfortable intensity. The impression is not poverty, because the wealth is immense. It is not carelessness, because many objects are exquisite and ritually meaningful. It is pressure. The burial feels like the work of a court trying to make everything right within circumstances that were not ideal. This is the hurried burial problem, and it is one of the most important mysteries surrounding the young king. It does not mean that the burial was chaotic or disrespectful. Ancient Egyptian royal funerals followed powerful traditions, and those responsible for Tutankhamun's transformation into an eternal king clearly took the task seriously. His body was mummified. His coffins were magnificent. His shrine surrounded him in layers of divine protection. His organs were placed under sacred guardianship. His name and royal identity were preserved in gold, stone, and ritual equipment. But the tomb itself raises questions. Why is it so modest for a pharaoh? Why are objects packed so densely? Why do some items seem adapted, altered, or reused? Why do the wall paintings have unusual features compared with other royal tombs? The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the overall pattern suggests urgency. The location and layout have led many scholars to wonder whether this was originally intended for someone else, perhaps a high-status non-royal person, or whether it was a smaller tomb adapted for royal use when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly. This idea is not universally settled in every detail, but it helps explain the scale. A full royal tomb might have required long planning and excavation. If Tutankhamun died before such a tomb was ready, the court may have needed an available space that could be converted quickly. The Egyptian afterlife did not wait politely for architectural perfection. Ritual time mattered. Mummification and burial had to proceed. The king had to be placed in a protected environment, supplied, sealed, and transformed. A smaller tomb could still become royal if the necessary symbolic world was installed inside it. The decoration of the burial chamber adds to the sense of haste. Only the burial chamber walls are painted, while other rooms are left undecorated. In grander royal tombs, Painted texts and images often extend through corridors and chambers, guiding the king through the dangerous night of the underworld. Tutankhamun's decorated program is more limited. The yellow-gold walls of the burial chamber show essential scenes: the king before deities, the ritual of opening the mouth, and the funerary journey that places him within divine order. The imagery does its work, but it does not unfold with the expansive complexity seen elsewhere. Some technical features, including dark spots on the painted walls, have also drawn attention. These spots are often understood as microbial growth that developed after the tomb was sealed, possibly because the plaster or paint had not fully dried before closure. If that interpretation is correct, it would be a striking physical clue of urgency. The room sealed before the walls had completely stabilized. Even the paintings carry political weight. I, who succeeds Tutankhamun, appears performing the opening of the mouth ritual for the dead king. This is a powerful image. In Egyptian funerary practice, the opening of the mouth restores the senses and capacities of the deceased, allowing the dead to breathe, speak, eat, and live again in the afterlife. For A to perform this ritual visually is to place himself in the role of legitimate successor and ritual heir. It is a scene of piety, but also a statement of power. Tutankhamun's death creates a vacancy, and the burial chamber helps show who steps into it. Scholars still debate the exact politics behind the transition, but the wall quietly records a moment when funerary care and royal succession overlap. The objects inside the tomb also tell a story of adaptation. Some pieces bear signs that they may have been made for others and then altered for Tutankhamun. Names can be changed, inscriptions can be modified, royal equipment can be reassigned. In a world where the king's name carried magical force, such changes were not trivial. They transformed an object's identity. Some scholars have argued that parts of Tutankhamun's burial equipment may have originally belonged to a female royal figure or to another member of the Amana family, though interpretations vary and not every claim is accepted equally. What survives in the record suggests at least some reuse and reworking, and that makes sense in a court under pressure. Royal workshops would have had materials, unfinished pieces, older items, and objects that could be adapted quickly when a sudden death demanded a complete burial. The nested coffins themselves have raised questions about style, proportion, and preparation. The famous inner gold coffin is unmistakably royal and extraordinary, but parts of the coffin's set and funerary equipment have prompted debate about whether everything was conceived as a unified group from the beginning. The golden mask, too, has been studied for traces of modification and inscriptional complexity. Such details do not diminish the object's beauty, they deepen it. A reused or altered royal object is not a fake, it is a witness to crisis, workshop practice, and the flexible power of ancient naming. In Egypt, identity could be ritually rewritten. An object made for one royal body might be transformed to protect another, if the name, image, and ritual context were properly adjusted. The packed arrangement of the rooms also feels practical rather than ceremonial in a perfectly planned sense. In the antechamber, objects are crowded together, some stacked or wedged in ways that suggest the available space was simply not enough for the full quantity of royal goods. Chariots were dismantled to fit. Furniture stood close together. Boxes were filled and arranged with little empty space around them. The annex was especially cramped and jumbled, partly because ancient robbers had disturbed it, and officials later restored order imperfectly, but perhaps also because the chamber was overloaded from the beginning. The tomb becomes a compressed palace, a royal afterlife forced into a smaller container than the ideal. Ancient robbery complicates the picture further. The tomb was entered at least twice not long after burial, and some portable goods were taken. Officials then resealed the doors, leaving behind evidence of both violation and repair. This means the tomb's disorder cannot be blamed on only one cause. Some crowding may reflect hurried packing. Some disarray may reflect robbers searching for valuables. Some arrangement may reflect the work of necropolis officials trying to restore a tomb they could not fully reset. No single explanation fully accounts for the final state Carter saw. The tomb was not frozen at the exact moment of burial. It was frozen after burial. Intrusion, official intervention, resealing, concealment, and centuries of silence. The more one looks, the more the hurried burial becomes not a failure, but a revelation. It shows how a royal system responds when a king dies too soon. It shows workshops adapting, priests completing essential rites, officials protecting legitimacy, and successors using funerary ritual to secure political order. It shows that eternity, in ancient Egypt, depended on speed as well as splendor. The court did not have unlimited time to create a perfect monument. It had to create an effective one. And by Egyptian standards, effectiveness meant that Tutankhamun's body was preserved. His name was present. His senses were ritually restored. His gods received him, and his tomb was sealed with the equipment of rebirth. In that sense, the rushed quality of the burial may be one reason it survived. A grander tomb, more visible and more famous in antiquity, might have attracted more attention. A larger monument prepared for a more powerful reign might have been robbed beyond recognition. Tutankhamun's modest, crowded tomb slipped under later debris and historical embarrassment. Its very imperfection helped protect it. The young king did not receive the greatest tomb in the valley, but he received one that endured. History sometimes preserves the hurried thing, the adapted thing, the almost forgotten thing, because it is just small enough to disappear. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb are often treated as wonders of wealth, but their deeper power comes from meaning. Gold was not placed around the king simply because it was beautiful, though it was certainly beautiful enough to stun the modern world into silence. In ancient Egyptian thought, gold carried the brightness of the gods. It did not tarnish like ordinary metals. It suggested permanence, radiance, and divine flesh. To cover a coffin in gold was not merely to display royal riches. It was to wrap the dead king in a material language of immortality. The tomb's greatest objects are therefore not decorations around a body. They are instruments of transformation, each one helping to turn a dead young ruler into an eternal being who could move through the dangerous night and rise again with the sun. The golden mask is the most famous of these instruments, and perhaps the most misunderstood because it has become so familiar. Seen in photographs, it can look like an emblem, almost a logo of ancient Egypt. But within the burial, it had a specific task. It lay over the head and shoulders of the mummy, protecting the king's face and giving him an imperishable identity. The mask does not show Tutankhamun as a fragile young man. It shows him as a perfected pharaoh, joined to the gods. Wearing the striped Nemes headdress, the false beard of divinity, and the protective cobra and vulture on his brow. These symbols connect him to kingship over Upper and Lower Egypt, and to the divine powers that guard the ruler. The face is calm because it belongs to eternity, not to biography. Its beauty is not personal vanity. It is theology made visible. Around that mask, the coffins create another set of meanings. Tutankhamun was placed within 3 nested coffins, each forming a protective shell around the royal body. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, is extraordinary, but the nesting itself matters as much as the material. Layer after layer separates the king from decay, danger, and disorder. The shape of the coffins identifies him with Osiris, the god of the dead and rebirth, whose crossed arms and regalia become a model for the resurrected king. The dead pharaoh is not imagined as disappearing into nothing. He becomes Osirian, transformed into a sacred form that can live in the afterlife while also participating in the daily solar cycle. In this way, Tutankhamun's burial joins two powerful religious ideas: the rebirth of Osiris and the nightly journey of the sun. The stone sarcophagus and the huge gilded shrine surrounding it deepen this layered protection. When Carter's team opened the burial chamber, they found that much of the room was occupied by a series of large wooden shrines covered in gold. These shrines enclosed the sarcophagus like sacred architecture compressed into a tomb chamber. Their surfaces carried protective texts and figures, turning the burial space into a guarded cosmic enclosure. The king was not simply lying in a coffin. He was hidden inside a sequence of sacred houses, each barrier marking a deeper movement from the human world into the divine. To modern eyes, the nested shrines can seem almost excessive, but in Egyptian belief, danger did not end at death. The dead needed layers of defense: physical, magical, textual, divine. Amulets carried this protection to the scale of the body. Within the mummy wrappings, dozens of amulets were placed in carefully meaningful positions. Some were made of gold, faience, stone, or glass. Some invoked specific gods. Others protected particular parts of the body or helped restore capacities the dead would need. The heart scarab, the Jed pillar, the Tayet knot, the Wedjat eye, and many other forms belong to a symbolic vocabulary that Egyptians had refined over centuries. An amulet was not a charm in a shallow sense. It was a working object, activated by material, shape, placement, and words. What survives in the record suggests that Tutankhamun's embalmers and priests were not simply wrapping a corpse. They were rebuilding a protected person, piece by piece, through ritual technology. The canopic equipment reveals the same concern. Tutankhamun's internal organs were preserved separately and guarded by a magnificent canopic shrine, protected by 4 goddesses whose arms seemed to reach around the sacred container. The organs were associated with protective deities, and their preservation was part of maintaining the king's completeness. Ancient Egyptian mummification was not based on modern anatomy, but it had its own profound logic. The body had to endure because identity required a place to return to. The organs had to be ritually secured because the person was not truly whole if essential parts were abandoned. Even after removal, separation, drying, wrapping, and storage, the king's body remained a unified sacred project. The guardian statues standing near the sealed burial chamber are among the most haunting objects in the tomb. Dark-skinned, gilded, and life-sized, they face outward like silent protectors. Their presence gives the tomb a threshold quality, as if the deeper chamber is not just another room but a guarded boundary between worlds. They are not portraits in any ordinary sense. They are royal, divine, and protective forms, placed to defend the king's passage and presence. In the dim light of Carter's first explorations, such figures must have seemed almost alive, not because anyone needed to imagine a curse, but because Egyptian funerary art was designed to make presence endure. A statue could hold power, an image could act, a name could live. Chariots, weapons, and shields seem at first to belong to a different world, one of hunting, warfare, and royal display. Yet they also fit the afterlife map. The king must continue as king beyond death, and kingship requires mastery. Chariots speak of movement, speed, elite skill and command. Bows and arrows speak of the pharaoh's power to strike chaos. Shields and daggers speak of defense and authority. The famous iron dagger, with metal likely from a meteoritic source, adds a surprising detail, a piece of rare sky metal resting with the body of a king who was being prepared for a cosmic journey. Scholars still debate the full ritual meaning of some weapons, and not every object can be reduced to a single symbol, but together they present Tutankhamun as active, protected, and powerful in the world beyond the tomb. Even the furniture participates in sacred meaning. The animal-shaped couches are not merely luxurious beds. Their forms evoke divine and protective creatures, part lion, part cow, part composite sacred imagination. They support the dead king's transformation and connect rest with rebirth. Boxes and chests, some covered with scenes of royal dominance over enemies, turn storage into ideology. A painted chest showing the king in battle does not necessarily record a real campaign led by Tutankhamun personally. It presents what a pharaoh must be: victorious, orderly, irresistible, the one who keeps Egypt safe from chaos. The evidence remains incomplete when it comes to matching such images to actual events in his reign, but their symbolic function is clear. The afterlife required not only food and furniture, but the image of perfect kingship. The treasures therefore form a map, not a map of roads and rivers, but a map of Egyptian hopes about death. The mask preserves identity. The coffins transform the body. The shrines create sacred space. The amulets defend vulnerable points. The canopic shrine protects inner life. The guardian statues hold the threshold. The weapons and chariots preserve royal power. The food, oils, games, and garments continue the habits of existence. Together, they answer the terror of death with order. Nothing is left to chance if ritual can help it. Nothing is merely practical if it can also be sacred. Nothing is merely beautiful if beauty can make eternity stronger. This is why Tutankhamun's tomb still feels so powerful after the first shock of gold has faded. It is not simply a treasure house. It is an argument against disappearance. Every object insists that the young king can continue breathing through ritual, seeing through restored senses, walking through divine lands, eating offerings, shining like gold, rising with the sun, and living as Osiris in the hidden country of the dead. Modern people may not share the belief, but the care behind it remains unmistakable. Around a short life, Egypt built a vast symbolic defense. Around a vulnerable body, it placed a universe. A king never enters eternity alone. Even when the tomb door is sealed and the valley returns to silence, the burial remains crowded with the actions of the living. Tutankhamun's tomb is centered on one body, one name, one golden face, but everything around him points to a wider human machinery: advisors who controlled policy, priests who restored gods, craftsmen who shaped sacred materials, embalmers who worked over the royal body, scribes who fixed identity in words, guards who watched the necropolis, and successors who had every reason to make the burial both proper and politically useful. The young king may be the brightest figure in the story, but he stands inside a circle of people whose decisions determined how he was buried, how he was remembered, and in some ways how he was forgotten. The most visible of these figures is A, the elderly courtier who appears on the wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, performing the opening of the mouth ritual. This image is not a casual decoration. It places A in an intimate and powerful position at the exact moment the dead king is being ritually restored. In Egyptian funerary belief, The opening of the mouth allows the deceased to breathe, speak, eat, see, and live again in the afterlife. For A to be shown performing it means he is not merely present. He is acting as the one who completes the transformation. Soon after Tutankhamun's death, I becomes pharaoh. The wall painting therefore works on two levels at once. It honours the dead king, and it helps announce the living successor. What survives in the record suggests a transition wrapped in ritual, where piety and power are almost impossible to separate. I was not a sudden stranger. He had served within the royal court for years, and appears to have held important titles during the Amarna period and afterward. He may have been connected by family or long service to the royal house, though the exact details remain debated. His career shows the kind of political flexibility required to survive Akhenaten's revolution, Tutankhamun's restoration, and the dangerous aftermath of a young king's death without a clear heir. To modern eyes, this can look suspicious. An older advisor close to the throne becomes king after the young ruler dies, but suspicion is not proof. Ancient politics often rewarded proximity, experience, and timing. I may have been ambitious, loyal, opportunistic, necessary, or some mixture of all these things. No single explanation fully accounts for the man behind the titles. Beyond A stands Horemheb, another crucial figure in the story's outer ring. He was a powerful military commander and later became pharaoh after A. Horemheb's reign helped close the Amarna period more forcefully, restoring traditional structures and reshaping memory so that the awkward sequence of Akhenaten, his immediate successors, Tutankhamun, and A could be minimized or erased in later official history. Horemheb did not bury Tutankhamun, but his later treatment of the period affects how Tutankhamun survives in the record. The young king's obscurity is not only the result of dying early, it is also the result of later political memory management. Kings who did not fit the desired story of continuity could be pushed into shadow, and ironically, that shadow may have helped protect Tutankhamun's tomb from the attention that greater fame might have drawn. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's queen, remains one of the most poignant and uncertain figures near the centre of the drama. She was likely born into the Amarna royal family, probably as a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and she became the wife of Tutankhamun as the court attempted to stabilize legitimacy. In the tomb, her presence is felt most vividly through objects and imagery, especially the golden throne where she appears with the king in a scene of tenderness and royal intimacy. Yet after Tutankhamun's death, her fate becomes difficult to trace. Some scholars connect her to a remarkable diplomatic episode known from Hittite sources, in which an Egyptian queen, widowed and without a son, is said to have asked the Hittite king to send a prince for marriage. Whether this queen was Akhenaten remains debated, but the possibility reveals the danger of the moment. A royal widow without a secure heir stood at the edge of the political storm. The priests around Tutankhamun also matter deeply. His reign is tied to the restoration of Amun and the older religious order after Akhenaten's Aten-centered upheaval. Priests did not simply chant in temples, they managed offerings, lands, workshops, calendars, sacred images, and institutional memory. Their influence reached into the economy and political legitimacy of the state. When Tutankhamun's name changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, priestly worlds regained public honor. In his burial, their expertise shaped the rituals that transformed him from dead ruler into eternal being. The tomb's amulets, shrines, canopic arrangements, and funerary scenes all belong to a learned ritual system maintained by specialists. The king's afterlife depended on their knowledge. The embalmers worked even closer to the mystery. Their names are mostly lost, yet their hands shaped the body that became the sacred center of the tomb. They removed organs, dried the body, applied resins and oils, wrapped the limbs, placed amulets, and turned flesh into a ritually protected form. Modern people often treat mummification as a technical process, but for Egyptians it was sacred craft. The embalmers were not preserving a specimen. They were helping create an Osirian body capable of survival beyond death. Some of their choices, especially the heavy use of resin, later caused difficulties for Carter's team and contributed to the damaged condition of the mummy, but within their own world, such materials may have expressed care, protection, and divine transformation. The evidence remains incomplete, and the intentions behind every embalming decision cannot be recovered. But the work itself was central to the king's eternity. Then there were the artists and craftsmen. They are everywhere in the tomb, though almost never named. They cut wood, hammered gold, carved alabaster, inlaid glass and semi-precious stones, painted boxes, stitched linen, shaped leather, fitted wheels, and wrote names that gave objects their power. Some materials came from far beyond Egypt's immediate landscape, reminding us that a royal burial depended on networks of trade, tribute, mining, diplomacy, and skilled labor: cedar, gold. Lapis lazuli, ebony, ivory, glass, faience, and rare metals speak to a world connected by routes across deserts, seas, and foreign courts. One lesser-known detail is that the splendor of Tutankhamun's tomb is also evidence of administration. Beauty required paperwork. Someone had to source materials, command workshops, allocate labor, inspect quality, and deliver finished objects before the burial clock ran out. The servants and workers of the necropolis formed the quietest layer. The Valley of the Kings was not only a place of royal silence, it was also a workplace. Men cut tombs, carried stone, plastered walls, mixed pigments, hauled equipment, guarded entrances, and lived in communities tied to royal funerary labor, especially at places like Deir el-Medina. By Tutankhamun's time, generations of specialized workers had helped create the hidden architecture of royal death. They knew the valley not as a mystery, but as terrain of labor, heat, tools, instructions, and risk. Some may have helped seal the young king's tomb without imagining that their work would become one of archaeology's most famous moments. History remembers the pharaoh, then Carter, then the treasures. It rarely remembers the shoulders that carried the boxes. All these people complicate the image of Tutankhamun as a solitary golden boy. His tomb is not the achievement of one ruler's personal greatness. It is the outcome of a court under pressure, a priesthood restoring order, workshops adapting materials, embalmers completing transformation, officials managing succession, and workers closing a small tomb in a valley already filled with the dead. In life, Tutankhamun may have been young, perhaps physically vulnerable, and politically guided by others. In death, he became the center of their combined effort. They did not leave us their full motives. They left arrangements, images, titles, seals, altered objects, and a burial that is both reverent and strategic. Around the king's silence, their decisions still speak. The curse begins where evidence grows too quiet and imagination becomes too loud. It does not rise from a single ancient inscription promising doom to whoever disturbs Tutankhamun's tomb, not in the way popular legend later suggests. It grows instead from a perfect modern mixture, a sealed royal burial, dazzling gold, the death of a wealthy patron, newspapers hungry for drama, public fascination with Egypt, and the old human habit of turning coincidence into pattern when the dead seemed too powerful to leave alone. The tomb itself was already mysterious enough. A young pharaoh had slept in darkness for more than 3,000 years, surrounded by guardian statues, shrines, sacred animals, spells, and objects meant to protect him from dangers beyond ordinary life. It did not take much for the modern world to imagine that some of those protections might turn outward. The death of Lord Carnarvon in 1923 became the spark. He had financed Carter's search, stood near the centre of the discovery, and entered the tomb story as one of its essential modern figures. A few months after the opening, he died in Cairo after complications connected to an infected mosquito bite and blood poisoning, though details were quickly turned into something stranger by the press. In a world already fascinated by spiritualism, ancient magic, and exoticized ideas of Egypt. His death seemed to arrive with theatrical timing. Here was the aristocratic sponsor of the most spectacular tomb discovery of the age, dead soon after entering the king's hidden world. For newspapers, the temptation was irresistible. The ancient dead had struck back. The boy king had claimed a victim. The sealed tomb was no longer only an archaeological site. It was a stage for supernatural revenge. Yet when the legend is examined closely, it begins to lose its shape. Howard Carter, the man most directly responsible for finding and opening the tomb, did not die immediately. He lived until 1939, many years after the discovery. Numerous people who entered or worked around the tomb also lived ordinary lifespans. The evidence remains incomplete when trying to track every claim made in popular accounts, partly because curse stories grew through repetition, embellishment, and selective memory. But the overall pattern does not support the idea of a deadly ancient force killing tomb visitors in some orderly sequence. Deaths happened, as deaths always happen, especially among adults living in a time before modern antibiotics and with travel, infection, illness, and stress all playing their part. The curse survives not because it explains the evidence, but because it makes the evidence feel meaningful. The modern myth also depends on a misunderstanding of Egyptian funerary protection. Ancient Egyptians certainly believed in powerful words, divine guardians, and magical defense of the dead. Tombs could include warnings, protective formulas, and images meant to keep hostile forces away. The dead needed defense against chaos, thieves, decay, and dangers in the afterlife. But the idea of a neat cinematic curse aimed at 20th century archaeologists is largely a modern creation. Egyptian magic was not a decorative superstition. It was part of a coherent religious system, deeply tied to words, images, ritual performance, and cosmic order. To reduce it to a horror story trap is to miss its seriousness. The guardians in Tutankhamun's tomb were not waiting like villains in a modern tale. They were placed to protect a king's transformation. Still, it is easy to see why the story took hold. The tomb's atmosphere almost writes the myth before anyone says it aloud. Two dark guardian statues stand before the burial chamber. The rooms are crowded with strange animal couches, gilded shrines, sealed boxes, and objects whose meanings are not immediately obvious to the public. The golden mask looks calm but inhumanly perfect. The mummy lies hidden under layers of sacred material, the language of ancient Egypt. When poorly understood or sensationally reported, can seem like a script from another world. Add to this the fact that the tomb had been sealed since the age of Bronze Age kingdoms, and every ordinary accident begins to feel connected. The mind does not like randomness. It prefers a story with intention. Newspapers in the 1920s understood this perfectly. Egyptomania was already strong. Ancient Egyptian designs influenced fashion, jewelry, architecture, cinema, advertising, and popular entertainment. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb did not enter a calm, scholarly world. It entered a media world ready to turn archaeology into spectacle. Reports emphasized glitter, secrecy, danger, and forbidden knowledge. Sometimes details were exaggerated. Sometimes they were invented or repeated without verification. The curse story became a kind of modern folklore, moving from article to article, dinner table to theatre, lecture hall to rumour. It gave the public a way to feel the tomb's power without studying the slow work of cataloguing objects or the complicated politics of the Amarna period. A curse is much easier to remember than a conservation report. There is a quieter reason the curse became so useful. It allowed modern audiences to feel that the ancient dead still had agency. Archaeology can be an uncomfortable act. It opens graves. It removes objects intended for the afterlife. It turns sacred equipment into museum exhibits and scientific data. Even when done carefully and respectfully, it involves crossing boundaries that ancient people deliberately sealed. The curse myth expresses, in sensational form, a real unease. Perhaps the dead should not be disturbed. Perhaps treasure has a moral cost. Perhaps the silence of a tomb is not empty, but guarded. No single explanation fully accounts for why people loved the curse story so much. But beneath the melodrama there is a genuine tension between curiosity and reverence. Carter himself was frustrated by sensationalism. For him, the tomb was a demanding archaeological responsibility, not a haunted chamber designed for newspaper drama. The work of clearing the tomb required years of patience. Fragile objects had to be stabilized before they could be moved. Materials reacted to new air, changing humidity, handling, and light. The most dangerous force in the tomb was not supernatural vengeance, but damage-cracking wood, flaking surfaces, hardened resins, delicate textiles, and the destructive consequences of moving things too quickly. The real drama was conservation. The real danger was that the ancient world, exposed after millennia of darkness, might begin to fall apart under modern attention. And yet the curse never fully disappears. It remains attached to Tutankhamun because it satisfies something deep in the story. The young king was nearly forgotten, then returned with a golden face and a myth of revenge. In life, his political power may have been limited by youth and circumstance. In death, popular imagination made him powerful enough to frighten the modern world. The curse gave him a strange second kingship, not over Egypt, but over fear, fascination, and the border between knowledge and taboo. It turned a small tomb into a global legend. It made every later visitor feel, even faintly, that entering the presence of Tutankhamun was not quite ordinary. The grounded truth is more interesting than the legend. There is no convincing evidence that an ancient curse killed the people connected with the tomb. There's abundant evidence that the tomb entered a modern world eager for mystery, profit, drama, and wonder. The curse belongs to the history of reception, not the history of the burial itself. It tells us less about ancient Egyptian magic than about the 20th century's imagination. It reveals how quickly archaeology can become mythology when gold, death, and media attention meet in the right place at the right time. But perhaps that is not a failure of the story. It is part of the story. Tutankhamun's tomb has always stood between fact and projection. The objects are real. The body is real. The political crisis is real. The damaged evidence is real. Around those realities, modern people built dreams: the perfect boy king, the murdered prince, the cursed tomb, the untouched treasure house, the golden doorway into eternity. Some dreams must be corrected. Others must simply be recognized for what they are. The curse is not the voice of ancient Egypt speaking clearly across time. It is the echo produced when modern fear enters an ancient room and hears itself answer. When science reopens Tutankhamun's tomb, it does not do so with the same gesture as Carter's candle at the doorway. The modern return is quieter, brighter, more technical, and in some ways more cautious. The great age of simply entering sealed spaces and removing wonders has passed. Tutankhamun's tomb has become not only an archaeological discovery, but a conservation problem, a medical case, a political symbol, a museum challenge, and a fragile archive under constant negotiation. Every object has already survived more than 3,000 years underground, and then a century of modern attention. Every scan, sample, movement, cleaning, display decision, or restoration carries risk. The mystery is no longer only what lies hidden in the dark. It is how much can be learned without harming what remains. The first scientific reopening begins almost as soon as the tomb is discovered, because Carter's work itself is a transition between old treasure hunting and modern archaeology. He photographs, records, numbers, draws, stabilizes, and catalogues with a seriousness that helps preserve context. Yet his era still lacks many tools and conservation standards that later generations take for granted. Some choices made during the early clearance now seem harsh, especially in the handling of the mummy and the separation of objects stuck together by ancient resin. But without Carter's patience, much more information might have been lost. The tomb becomes a lesson in the history of archaeology itself. Even careful work belongs to its time, and later knowledge often arrives too late to prevent earlier damage. The evidence remains incomplete partly because ancient decay did its work, partly because robbers disturbed the tomb, and partly because modern investigation, however well-intentioned, also leaves marks. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new technologies begin asking old questions in less invasive ways. X-rays, CT scans, DNA analysis, chemical testing, fiber study, pigment analysis, and digital imaging all bring new kinds of light into the story. The mummy can be examined without unwrapping it again. Bones can be studied in three-dimensional detail. Fractures, dental development, foot structure, skull shape, and embalming materials can be reassessed. Objects can be analysed for manufacturing techniques, trade materials, and later alterations. The tomb becomes a laboratory, but a very unusual one, a sacred royal burial whose contents are also national heritage and global cultural memory. No responsible researcher can treat it as just another data set. The study of Tutankhamun's body shows both the promise and the difficulty of modern science. CT scans have helped researchers look at his skeletal condition, age at death, possible foot problems, and injuries that earlier examinations could not interpret as clearly. Genetic testing has been used to explore his family relationships, placing him within a cluster of royal mummies from the Amarna and late 18th dynasty period. Such work has suggested close biological connections among his relatives and supported the idea that his father was likely Akhenaten, though debates continue around the exact identities of some mummies, especially his mother and other royal women. DNA can narrow the possibilities, but it does not always restore names erased by history. A genetic relationship is not the same as a labelled portrait. Science can redraw the family tree, but some branches remain shadowed. Material science has opened equally surprising windows. One of the most famous examples is the iron dagger found with Tutankhamun's mummy. For many years, it was admired as an exquisite royal object, but later analysis suggested that its iron came from meteoritic material, rich in nickel and other elements consistent with metal from the sky. This detail is powerful because iron was still rare in Egypt at the time, before the widespread use of iron tools and weapons. The dagger therefore speaks not only of craftsmanship, but of prestige, exchange, and the ancient fascination with unusual materials. A blade placed beside the king's body may have carried the symbolic force of heaven itself, though scholars still debate how Egyptians of Tutankhamun's day understood and named such rare iron. What survives in the record suggests that the object was extraordinary, even in a tomb filled with extraordinary things. Other treasures reveal networks far beyond the burial chamber: glass, faience, semi-precious stones, gold, wood, and resins can be studied to trace technologies and connections. Some materials were local, others came through trade, tribute, or diplomatic exchange. Ebony and ivory evoke roots southward and beyond. Lapis lazuli points toward distant lands in Asia. Cedar wood suggests connections to the Levant. The tomb's wealth is therefore not only Egyptian, it is Egyptian power gathering the world into a royal afterlife. Each material carries a geography, a labour history, and a chain of movement across deserts, rivers, workshops, and courts. The young king's tomb becomes a map of New Kingdom reach, compressed into boxes and shrines. Conservation has become one of the most urgent modern sciences around Tutankhamun. The tomb was sealed for millennia in a relatively stable environment, then suddenly exposed to air, people, light, dust, humidity changes, and tourism. The wall paintings, already marked by mysterious brown spots likely connected to ancient microbial activity, require careful monitoring. The painted surfaces are delicate. The plaster, pigments, and underlying rock respond to changes that may be invisible at first. Even human breath can matter in a small tomb visited by many people. Modern conservation teams have studied airflow, dust, humidity, lighting, and visitor impact, trying to protect the burial chamber while still allowing controlled access. The danger is not a curse, it is the slow chemistry of exposure. The objects face similar challenges. Wood shrinks, cracks, and responds to dryness. Gilding can lift. Textiles can weaken into powder. Leather can stiffen and break. Ancient adhesives may fail. Resins can darken or remain chemically active in unexpected ways. Many items from the tomb were moved, conserved, displayed, stored, or re-examined over the past century, and each movement involves decisions. A museum display may bring beauty to millions, but it also places an object under new environmental demands. A scientific test may answer one question while consuming a tiny part of the material. A restoration may stabilize an object while changing how future generations see it. No single explanation fully accounts for how best to balance knowledge, access, preservation, and respect. One lesser-known modern story concerns the tomb itself as a place under pressure from fame. Tutankhamun's burial chamber is small, and fame brings bodies, heat, moisture, and dust. To reduce damage, conservation efforts have included careful cleaning, improved ventilation, protective barriers, and the creation of a highly accurate replica tomb for visitors. This replica is not meant to replace the original emotionally, but it raises a serious question about the future of heritage. Is it better for thousands of people to stand in the actual room where the king was buried, slowly changing it by their presence, or to experience a faithful copy while the original rests more quietly? Scholars, conservators, officials, and visitors may answer differently, but the question itself shows how Tutankhamun's afterlife has changed. He was once protected from robbers. Now he must be protected from admiration. Science has also corrected older fantasies. It has made the murder story less certain. It has complicated the image of the perfectly healthy golden youth. It has shown possible disease, injury, and inherited vulnerability without reducing the king to any single diagnosis. It has revealed object histories, material origins, and signs of reuse. It has made the tomb less simple and more human. But science has not stripped away mystery. Instead, it has refined it. The unknowns are no longer vague shadows, they are precise gaps. Which injury mattered? Which object was made for whom? How quickly was the tomb prepared? How did political pressure shape the burial? What did the young king actually do in his own reign? Which missing records would change the story if they survived? In the end, the modern reopening of Tutankhamun's tomb is an act of listening with better instruments. The scanners, microscopes, cameras, and chemical tests do not replace the original silence of the valley. They lean into it. They ask the gold where it came from, the bones what they endured, the paint how it aged, the wood what forests it remembers, and the mummy what can still be known without further harm. Sometimes the answers arrive clearly. Sometimes they arrive as probabilities. Sometimes they refuse to arrive at all. The young king's mystery survives not because science has failed, but because the past is not a locked box that opens all at once. It is more like the tomb itself, chamber after chamber, layer after layer, each revelation protected by another door. After a century of attention, Tutankhamun remains strangely unfinished. The tomb has been opened, photographed, catalogued, scanned, conserved, studied, argued over, and transformed into one of the most recognizable archaeological discoveries on Earth. His mask has travelled through books, museums, documentaries, classrooms, posters, souvenirs, and dreams. His name is more famous now than it ever was during his lifetime, and yet the closer the evidence is examined, the more the young king seems to retreat behind the things that preserved him. Gold survives more easily than motive. Coffins survive more easily than decisions. Bones survive more easily than final breaths. A tomb can be full to the ceiling and still leave the most important questions unanswered. The first unresolved mystery is the simplest and most stubborn. Exactly how did Tutankhamun die? The old murder story has lost much of its force, but the absence of a clear assassination does not automatically create a clear natural cause. His body shows possibilities rather than a single conclusion. A leg injury may have mattered, or it may have been damage after death. Malaria may have weakened him, or it may have been one infection among several. Genetic vulnerabilities may have shaped his health, but they do not explain the final moment by themselves. Foot problems may have affected his movement, but they do not tell us what ended his life. The evidence remains incomplete, and because the mummy was altered by embalming, ancient chemistry, time, and early modern handling, some answers may never become certain. Tutankhamun's death is not hidden because no one has looked. It is hidden because the surviving body cannot give back everything that happened to the living one. Then there is the question of his real political role. Was Tutankhamun merely a sacred figurehead used by older advisors to reverse Akhenaten's revolution? Or did he gradually become an active young ruler with his own choices, preferences, and authority? The answer may lie somewhere between those extremes. But the record does not allow a clean portrait. As a child king, He almost certainly depended on powerful officials. Names such as A and Horemheb stand close to the machinery of government and succession. Priests of Amun benefited from the restoration. Scribes and courtiers framed his reign as a return to divine order. Yet Tutankhamun was not frozen at age 9. He lived into his late teens. By the end of his reign, he may have understood the ritual, political, and dynastic pressures around him far more deeply than modern shorthand suggests. What survives in the record suggests a young king moving through a system that both elevated and constrained him, but the balance between personal agency and controlled symbolism remains debated. His family remains another field of shadow. Genetic research has clarified some relationships and challenged older assumptions, especially about his likely father and mother. But royal mummies are not labelled as neatly as modern curiosity would like. The identity of his mother, the full place of Nefertiti, the sequence of rulers after Akhenaten, and the roles of figures such as Smenkhkare and Neferneferuaten still invite argument. The Amarna period is a puzzle with missing names, altered inscriptions, damaged monuments, reused objects, and later attempts at erasure. Tutankhamun stands inside that puzzle, not outside it. His fame can make him seem like the key to the whole age, but he is also one of its victims. He inherited confusion, and then later history added more. The tomb itself remains uncertain in origin. Was it originally intended for Tutankhamun from the beginning, or was it adapted quickly after his unexpected death? Its modest size, limited decoration, and crowded content suggest adaptation, but the precise history is difficult to prove. Some theories have proposed that parts of the tomb complex, or even hidden spaces nearby, might relate to other royal burials. Popular attention has especially circled around the possibility of lost chambers and missing queens, because the imagination naturally wants the next sealed door. Modern surveys have tested some of these claims, and the more dramatic versions remain unproven. Still, the broader question persists why this tomb, this size, this arrangement. For a pharaoh of Egypt, no single explanation fully accounts for every architectural, decorative, and material clue. The tomb may be a compromise between ritual necessity, available space, and sudden death. The objects raise their own unresolved problems. Some were clearly made for Tutankhamun, others may have been altered, reused, or reassigned. A name changed on a coffin or shrine is not just a practical adjustment, it is a sign of political pressure and ritual transformation. If parts of the burial equipment were first intended for another royal person, who was that person? A predecessor, a female ruler, a member of the Amarna family whose own burial history is now lost. Scholars still debate these possibilities because style, inscription, proportion, and workshop practice do not always point in one direction. The reuse of royal objects can reveal urgency, but it can also conceal earlier histories. Tutankhamun's tomb may preserve not only his afterlife, but fragments of other unfinished royal destinies. Even the 2 tiny mummified remains found in the tomb, usually understood as the daughters of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, open a quiet dynastic mystery. Their presence suggests hopes for succession that did not continue. Without a surviving heir, the royal line became vulnerable. What happened to Akhenaten after Tutankhamun's death remains uncertain. Did she marry A? Did she vanish into the political shadows? Was she the Egyptian queen who, according to Hittite records, made the astonishing request for a foreign prince to become her husband? The evidence is tantalizing but not complete. If that diplomatic episode does belong to her, it would reveal a crisis far more dramatic than the golden stillness of the tomb suggests. If it does not, her fate remains even more obscure. The mystery of memory may be the deepest one. Tutankhamun was not celebrated for long after his death. Later rulers had reasons to distance themselves from the Amarna period. Horemheb and the Ramesside kings reshaped official history to present a cleaner restoration of order. Tutankhamun's name faded, and his tomb disappeared beneath the practical debris of the valley. Was this neglect deliberate punishment, bureaucratic convenience, political embarrassment, or simply the effect of a short reign swallowed by more powerful successors? The evidence remains incomplete, but the result is clear. His obscurity helped save him. The very process that reduced his ancient fame allowed his modern fame to explode. It is one of history's stranger bargains, erased enough to survive, found enough to become immortal. There are also mysteries that do not announce themselves with drama. What did his voice sound like? Did he enjoy the games buried with him? Did he walk with pain every day? Or only at times did he feel loyalty to the restored cult of Amun? Or was religion for him a language of rule shaped by others? Did he remember Amarna with affection, discomfort, or confusion? Did he know he was living in the aftermath of a revolution? Did he fear death when illness came? Or did the rituals around him make the passage feel ordered? These questions cannot be answered by gold or DNA. They belong to the lost interior of a life. That's why Tutankhamun remains powerful. He's not a solved mystery, but a preserved boundary. On one side stands the evidence, the tomb, the mummy, the objects, the inscriptions, the scans, the historical context. On the other side stands the person, partly visible and partly gone. The space between them is where the fascination lives. A king can be surrounded by treasures and still remain unreachable. A tomb can be opened and still keep secrets. A century of science can sharpen the questions without ending them. Tutankhamun endures because he is both revealed and hidden, both overexposed and unknown, both the most familiar face of ancient Egypt and one of its most delicate silences. Tutankhamun becomes immortal almost by accident. In life, he is a brief ruler at the end of a troubled royal line. A young pharaoh used to restore a wounded religious order after the dazzling disruption of Akhenaten. In death, he is buried in a tomb smaller than the grand resting places of many kings around him. In later memory, he is pushed toward obscurity by rulers who prefer a cleaner story of Egypt's past. His name does not dominate temple walls across the country. His reign does not become the model by which later pharaohs measure themselves. For more than 3,000 years, he is not the king Egypt most loudly remembers. And then the modern world opens a sealed doorway and finds that forgetting has preserved what fame might have destroyed. This is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. The kings who were greater in life were often poorer in survival. Their tombs attracted attention, robbery, reuse, damage, and centuries of intrusion. Tutankhamun's burial, modest, crowded, partially disturbed, and then hidden beneath later debris, kept enough of its original world to become the most complete royal discovery ever made in the Valley of the Kings. He did not build the Great Pyramid. He did not create the Egyptian Empire. He did not reign with the long authority of Rameses II or the military reach of Thutmose III. Yet his tomb gave the modern imagination something those larger careers could not give, the feeling of standing almost at the threshold of an ancient royal burial before time had fully stripped it away. That feeling changed Egyptology and popular culture at once. For scholars, the tomb was a dense archive of New Kingdom burial practice, royal craftsmanship, material culture, funerary belief, and Amarna period politics. For the public, it was something more immediate: gold in the dark, a young king's face, a sealed chamber, a story that seemed to step directly from myth into newspaper headlines. The discovery arrived at the right historical moment to become global. Photography could carry the objects outward. Newspapers could turn each stage of the opening into suspense. Museums and exhibitions could later transform the tomb's contents into encounters seen by millions. Tutankhamun became a modern icon not because everyone understood his reign, but because his image made ancient Egypt feel suddenly close. The golden mask did more than represent him. It became a symbol for an entire civilization in the eyes of many people. That is both powerful and unfair. Ancient Egypt lasted for thousands of years and contained countless kings, queens, workers, farmers, priests, scribes, artists, foreigners, migrants, soldiers, children safely held within families, and communities whose lives cannot be reduced to one royal burial. Tutankhamun's face has sometimes overshadowed the complexity of Egypt itself. But symbols work by concentration. In one object, people see divine kingship, craftsmanship, death, beauty, mystery, wealth, fragility, and survival. The mask is not all of Egypt, but it opens a door through which many first enter the ancient world. His legacy also belongs to modern Egypt. The tomb's discovery occurred during a period of intense political change, when questions of ownership, excavation, colonial power, national heritage, and cultural identity mattered deeply. Ancient Egyptian objects had long been removed into foreign collections, often under arrangements that later generations would question sharply. Tutankhamun's tomb, however, remained fundamentally tied to Egypt, and its treasures became central to Egyptian heritage. The story is not just about Western discovery. It is also about the land that held the tomb, the Egyptian workers who helped uncover and conserve it, the officials who managed it, and the continuing responsibility to protect it. Scholars still debate the ethics and history of archaeology in this period, and rightly so, because every golden object carries not only ancient meaning, but modern questions about who has the right to interpret, display, and care for the past. Tutankhamun's fame has also changed how people think about archaeology itself. The discovery created a dream of the untouched tomb, the hidden chamber, the spectacular find waiting beneath dust. That dream has inspired generations, but it can also distort expectations. Most archaeology is not gold, it is pottery, soil layers, seeds, bones, mud brick, tool marks, fragments, and patient comparison. Tutankhamun's tomb is exceptional precisely because it is not normal. If every excavation is judged against its glitter, then the quieter evidence of ordinary lives may seem less important than it truly is. The deeper lesson of the tomb is not that archaeology is treasure hunting. It is that context can make even a small object speak across millennia, if it is recorded with care. Still, the lure of hidden rooms has never left him. Every generation seems to hope that Tutankhamun has one more secret, another chamber, another queen, another body, another inscription that will finally solve the Amarna puzzle. Some claims have been tested and found unproven. Others remain part of broader scholarly debate. The desire is understandable. The tomb itself was discovered after many believed the valley had little left to offer. So Tutankhamun teaches people not to trust finality too quickly. But he also teaches restraint. Not every wall hides a queen. Not every scratch is a doorway. Not every mystery becomes truer because people want it badly. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible history must allow incompleteness to remain when proof does not arrive. His survival has become a meditation on chance. A royal death happens too soon. A tomb may be adapted. Robbers enter but do not empty it. Officials reseal the doors. Later activity hides the entrance. The king's historical reputation fades. Excavators search for years, nearly stop, and then uncover a step. Each link in the chain is fragile. Remove one, and the story may vanish. If the tomb had been fully robbed, Tutankhamun might be a minor name in specialist books if Carter had not continued. Another generation might have found it differently, or damaged it, or missed it again. If the valley had shifted in another way, the entrance might have been exposed and destroyed long before modern archaeology. No single explanation fully accounts for survival like this. It is history, accident, and patience bound together. And so the young king who would not vanish becomes more than the sum of his reign. He becomes a reminder that the past is not preserved according to justice or importance. It survives unevenly. A great ruler may disappear almost entirely, while a short-lived pharaoh keeps his sandals, games, beds, daggers, shrines, and golden face. A forgotten tomb may speak louder than a ruined temple. A single sealed room may change how the world imagines an entire civilization. Tutankhamun's power lies in that imbalance. He is not the greatest pharaoh. He is the pharaoh who came back with his world still around him. And now the story begins to quiet again. The bright rooms fade back into the valley, and the gold returns to shadow. The boy behind the mask remains partly unreachable, as all people from the deep past must remain. His breath is gone. His court is gone. The hands that wrapped him, carried his shrines, painted his walls, and sealed his door are gone. Even the language of certainty softens around him, because the evidence can only carry us so far before silence begins again. Yet something endured, not everything, never everything, but enough. Enough to show that a short life can leave a long echo. Enough to show that forgetting can become a kind of shelter. Enough to remind us that human beings have always struggled against disappearance with whatever tools they possessed: stone, paint, gold, names, rituals, songs, records, memories, and the careful placement of beloved or necessary things beside the dead. Tutankhamun's tomb is not only a place of treasure, it is a place where time hesitated. For a little while, the world of ancient Egypt remained folded in a dark chamber beneath the cliffs beds waiting for sleep, wheels waiting for motion, food waiting for a journey, statues waiting at their posts, and a young king resting inside layers of protection. When the door opened, the silence broke, but it did not vanish completely. Some of it still clings to the objects. Some of it remains in the painted chamber. Some of it follows the golden face wherever people gather to look at it and wonder what can truly survive. Far above the tomb, the desert continues its older work. The cliffs warm in the morning and cool at dusk. The Nile moves through the green land beyond the west bank. Shadows return to the valley floor, covering old paths, sealed entrances, and empty spaces where other kings once dreamed of eternity. Tutankhamun has travelled farther than he ever did in life, through museums, books, screens, and human imagination. Yet the deepest image is still the simplest one, a hidden doorway under stone. A candle trembling in ancient air, and beyond it, the faint glow of a forgotten king waiting in the dark.